Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamie Youngson, and I'm going to be your chair for this evening. I'm looking forward to this. What I perceive to be is going to be an excellent discussion around overloading for successful injury rehabilitation. There are three panel members today. We've got Dr. Dave Clark from Scotland, we've got Alex Natera from Australia, and Ken Ware. So welcome, Alex. Alex has just joined us. I know we've got Ken and Dave has joined us too. So just to run through a little bit of, I suppose, format for this evening, the next 60 to 75 minutes, we're going to be asking, obviously, a roundtable discussion around the experiences of Alex, Dave, and Ken, all from different backgrounds, different experiences. But hopefully we can synthesize that together under a really meaningful conversation here tonight. So I'd like to welcome you as viewers and listeners. Obviously your cameras are switched off, as are your mics. But hopefully, in regards to, we'll talk about interaction in just a second, you'll take a lot from this. So the topic, as we say, I'll give you a little bit of background about that in just a second. But I'll just cover, obviously, each of our panel members in brief, because I know that you've probably read their bios online. So just to start with Dr. Dave Clark. Dave, his background, he spent many years in strength and conditioning and sport in general, and sports management. He has an undergraduate degree in sports science and a master's in exercise science, both from the University of Cape Town. And more recently, he's gained his PhD in 2018 from the University of Stirling in Scotland, and that was off the back of his time at the Scottish Institute of Sport. But he served as the national fitness coach for the Springboks, his mother country, as well as Wales and Ireland. But he's also been heavily involved with Olympic sports, Commonwealth Games, Olympic sports, with notable highlights of Sir Chris Hoy, the trap cyclist, 11-time world champion and 6-time Olympic champion. So he's had a lot to do with Chris throughout his career, and we'll learn a little bit about that tonight. But now he's working for Robert Gordon University, and he's an academic lead in the exercise science department there, who looks after a couple of different courses. We've also got Mr. Alex Natera. Now, Alex is he's waving now in the background. He's for those of you who probably know him in the sports science realm, he's also spent many years, 25 years in fact, as a sports practitioner, and he's worked across institutes, professional sport. He came from rugby. He's also dabbled in directorship of rugby, but he also now he's working as the sports science coordinator at the New South Wales Institute of Sport. And then Ken Ware. Now, comes from a different background. Ken is the founder of Nutritional Sciences and Neurophysics Therapy, and he's been in private practice for 35 years. But what's important is that Ken comes from a background of bodybuilding and powerlifting. He was actually Mr. Universe back in 1994, but he's also been national and state level champion in powerlifting. But he's actually just qualified in a few weeks' time. He's off to Mexico to the Masters WWF Universe in Mexico at the tender age of, I think, 67. Ken, you might want to correct us on that. And he's going with his wife as well, Nikki, so she's competing as well. But Ken is also a dignified recipient of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's Australian Sports Medal, and he got that in 2000 in recognition of his personal contribution to the development of Australian sporting culture. But Ken, as well, has done a lot of work in research and development in this novel space that he'll talk to us tonight. But collectively, we're talking about 80 years of experience, in sport and therapies between our three panel members tonight. So we're going to be, having a really good discussion, I feel. But to give you a bit of a background, and this is where, how did this come about, this discussion? It didn't just come about by chance. It was something that Alex had posted, I think it was back in 2022, Alex, on your Instagram, and you had highlighted through using ForceDex or force plate technology that asymmetries between an injured leg and non-injured leg, you felt may be eliminated as you increased load, but instead you actually saw that diminish, as the load increased past 60% of RM, if I'm correct. Now, off the back of that, Dave Clark. Now, I've got a history with Dave. Dave was my when I was serving my apprenticeship. So before I came to VALD as a client success manager, I was a strength and conditioning coach for 18 years in high performance sport, and Dave was my first mentor boss at the Scottish Institute. And I know that Dave has PhD focused on trunk activation and patterning or musculature of patterning in various squat exercises. And so I saw this synthesis. And then Ken, I was introduced to Ken about 7 years ago, and with his background, but also in therapies, and he deals with spinal cord injuries, I thought this would be a really healthy conversation. So if I'm misrepresented in any way, please, jump in and add to that. So, but just for the format for this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to spend the next 50 to 55 minutes as a roundtable discussion. I'll be fielding questions to our panel members. And what I'll ask for you is if you want to interact as our listeners and viewers, please, add to the comments box and ask if you have any questions. Just tell us, who it's for, the question, and if you want to add your name as well as your occupation, and so we get a feel for context and how we can, return that question to you from the panel member, and that will come in the last 15, 20 minutes of this session. So from around about the 55-minute mark, we'll start fielding Q&A back and forward. Now, I'm going to be ably assisted by my colleague, Dan Romeo, in the background, so credit to him for joining us tonight. So I'm really looking forward to having his assistance. But as I said, if you want to, in acknowledgement of any responses, feel free to add an emoji, okay, as well as make any comments in the comments box up there in the top. It says Q&A, just add to that thread. But yeah, without further ado, we'll get started. So I just want to, we'll start off with some nice questions. I'm going to put this to Alex first, okay, and just tell us about some of your key influence, Alex, throughout your professional career so far, and how they have really shaped your practice so far, and maybe taking a bit of an angle around, rehabilitation, which I know you've done a lot of.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here in such esteemed company too. I feel like I should be on the other side, listening and just absorbing, but we'll try and balance both, because it'd be fantastic just to hear from Ken and Dave too. So, look, my biggest influences, they're varied for sure. I think one of the biggest ones was I was in charge of a rugby club for about 4 or 5 seasons, and it was a really interesting time, very early 2000s. And I was able to try a lot of different things. And by trying and failing and trying quite radical things, sometimes I started coming across a few gems and just understanding a little bit more about the complexity of the neuromuscular system and how that works, and how different stimuli can really have an adaptive response across a realm and a range of things other than what we were sort of understanding from our textbooks. And Craig White, a famous S&C practitioner back then, he was at WAS and Lions and so on. He had a concept called power endurance that he was giving his players, and my team absorbed a lot of those players and on loan and whatnot. And so I got introduced to this concept of power endurance, and then funny enough, I'm almost about finishing my PhD on it in a few months' time. So what I've learned from that has been phenomenal. Again, just not straight what we've known about S&C 101, but very, very different complex side of things. There's also a time period in my life, and I'll try and be quick so everyone gets a say, time period in my life where I lost faith in strength and conditioning, or strength in particular. I was doubting the benefit I was having when I was getting guys stronger and more powerful, and that transferring to the pitch or the field. And it wasn't so readily happening. I was being able to do my core job of getting people strong and powerful, but it wasn't showing dividends. And I then switched by chance to sprint cycling. And it was then that clarity came back into the whole sort of spectrum understanding. Actually, what you can put in can come out, pretty readily, depending on the sport you're working with and the complexity of that sport. And then switching straight from there into track and field and really uncovering or working with a coach that worked under Anatoly Bondarchuk, Dr. B, and learning his methods and getting a greater understanding of supercompensation and adaptation, but not from what we were taught, but more how it really happens in the real world with athletes and how that transfers to something more complex like upright sprinting, for example. So a lot of different, angles there that influenced me as I went.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'll now put that same question. I'm going to leave Ken till last because he comes from a different angle, and I'll be really keen to see how he complements Alex and Dave. So, Dave, if you wouldn't mind, responding to that question as well, thank you.
Jamie, while Ken and Dave get started,
you carry on.
Yeah, I probably didn't answer your question completely there in terms of what we're going to be speaking about today in terms of rehab. And I think one of the biggest influence I have, and I'm not ashamed to say it, but I started working at the English Institute of Sport. That's not what I'm ashamed of, by the way. I started working with the English Institute of Sport, and here's Dave. I'll finish this quickly, mate. And I remember being very, very passive in my rehab of this particular SBX athlete, so snowboard cross athlete, had an osteochondral defect on the end of their femur. And I remember I must have been 6 full plyo sessions in of just steady increments in load and being so prescriptive about everything that I was doing slightly different, just a little bit more and a little bit more. And I remember the physio I was working with at the time, her name was Anna, I can't remember her full name. She said to me, Alex, we got 10 weeks before this athlete has to be on the snow. If you keep going the way you're going, will we actually get her on the snow? And I went, oh, of course. And so I guess that changed my mentality a lot in terms of how, maybe, dare I say in inverted commas, how aggressive we can safely but aggressively load people up to get them back to their sport.
Thanks, Alex. No, that was a good one. Dave, welcome. Nice to see you.
Great. Well, eventually we got sorted. The camera and the mic were out of my control for a while there, so I was trying to get it sorted, but I think Daniel sorted it, so thanks, Daniel. Jamie, could you remind me of the question you posed to Alex, please?
So it was very much around your key influences, Dave, in your professional career and how they've shaped your practice, but with a slant on rehab. And I'm not ashamed to say that you're the reason probably why I'm sitting here, in a sports technology company, because you introduced me to dynamometry. So anyway, I'll pass that one on to you. And here's Ken.
Yeah, listen, the early days, I headed off on a career in physical education and then discovered there was such a thing as sports science. And the only avenue for me to do that was at the University of Cape Town with Professor Tim Noakes. And I left, I went in there as a mature student, did that, and really learned scientific inquisitiveness and the role of research in sport and exercise science in its purest form there. They were a high-performing academic unit in international terms. They'd go to the American College of Sports Medicine every year and present papers beyond the capacity or beyond what the size of the unit was, really. And then after I'd moved to the UK, I came up to Scotland when the Institute started and got the job at the Scottish Institute. And it just so coincided that Mike Stone moved across here with Meg, who got the job at the Institute as the athletics coach. And Mike played a big part in the early development of strength conditioning in the UK. But forget about that. He played a big part in my development as a strength and conditioning coach. Because at that point in time, I'd learned strength and conditioning off paper, because in South Africa there was nothing, so I'd become CS qualified by going to a conference in Arizona and just reading books. I didn't know what double knee bend was in a clean or anything like that. And it was Mike that really introduced me to all of that and the role of compound lifts and the nuances and so on. And so I was really lucky to be in that situation in the early stages of my role at the Institute, because that really set me up. And I would say today I'd regard myself as a traditional strength conditioning coach based on the fact that I was schooled by Mike, as simple as that. But just like, but Alex, it's been an up and down journey, and there have been times where it's been quite simple. Like I've always said, if you work at track sprint cycling, you get stronger and it goes into the pedal for sure. And if you get clever, you do a bit of power and it goes into the pedal, and that's just delightful. But then at the same time, I started working with canoe slalom, which is completely different. And when I arrived, everybody sort of had push-pull focus because they were paddlers, and that was push-pull. But no one ever looked under the deck of the boat, and your feet are fixed onto foot plates, and your push-pull comes through the full chain of the body, So, and then lots of the paddlers were saying in big water when they were navigating upward turns and so on, some of them had kicked the foot plates out, which tells me that the force was going through the length of the body. And so if we were just lying on benches doing push-pull, we were missing a significant part of the chain that was there to transfer power. So when I arrived at canoe slalom with significant opposition and challenge, I introduced compound lifts and upright lifts. But clearly the aim wasn't to get stronger, to put more force through the pedal, but to develop that trunk conductivity and ensure that you collapsed not because of your trunk if you were confronted with big water, but you collapsed because possibly of a weaker upper limb situation that we could address at a later stage. So yeah, that was interesting, and it just showed that every situation was very different. And I'll park it there because we'll talk about technology later, I'm sure.
We will, yeah. And I think it's certainly, it was a bit of I was a bit of a laughing stock at the Australian Institute of Sport, because I used to talk about the total kinetic chain, and that's obviously drawing down from, my infancy, as a strength and conditioning coach, and that's all they would hear about is a total kinetic chain or the kinetic chain or posterior kinetic chain. So, yeah, but it was understanding how forces transfer up and down the body. But I'm going to move on to Ken, because Ken's going to obviously take quite a unique angle, or I suppose in terms of how he describes this. So, Ken, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. And it is a big thrill to be here and be able to share my knowledge and years of experience with everybody. And I think that's part of it. As Einstein said, with knowledge comes a responsibility of sharing it. So that's what we're all about. So the meeting, and congratulations on attracting such a large audience too. That's very, very well done. It shows there's a lot of participants and a lot of people interested in this topic. But Alex did say a lot that was inspirational to me as well. But I'll just track and I'll review that. And again, Tim Noakes is one of my heroes. I refer a lot to Tim Noakes that David mentioned in his little talk there. So a lot of Tim Noakes, I've used Tim Noakes to support a lot of my ideas and the framework of my ideas. But so physics therapy obviously has some initial conditions, and going back in the early 80s when I was trying to become a Mr. Universe overnight, I'd already acquired a lot of injuries. So I was in my early 20s, and there's some old gentlemen training in the gym that I was training, powerlifting gym over in Perth, and they were called what they referred to as physical culturists back in those days. Now these older fellas, what I've seen as older fellas, I'm that age myself now, but they were up on doing dip. One particular fellow, he was up doing dips, and he had 3 20-kilo plates tied around his waist. And he was doing these sets of dips, and he'd get off and he'd start talking to his mate with total composure, like as if nothing happened. And in the other room, all of these world champion powerlifters were slapping one another and yelling and screaming and doing all this other sorts of things, and that I thought I needed to do also to be able to get the results that I was wanting to achieve. So I became really curious about how these guys could do such a thing and remain so calm and composed. And I asked the question, and all I got with the answer was, Ken, you're going to need to get your technique sorted out, mate. The way that you're training, you're going to kill yourself. Just slow everything down, drop all those weights back, and just start focusing on your technique, which I knew what proper technique was, but that was being destroyed by my pure application to my training. So when I did that, went back and dropped some weight off, and I was doing a squat in particular, and started to descend quite slowly, that's when I noticed a lot of tremor activity taking place in my system, and it became quite violent. And at that particular stage, and the slower I went, the more it increased in value. As I come to the top, I felt that I was going to vomit, and I thought, wow, this is really upsetting. So I took some more weight off, and then started to do it. And it even got more volatile in that respect. So at that point in time, I said, righto, this is it. I've thrashed my nervous system. I might as well give up. If this is the best I've got, underneath all what's going on here, my nervous system's a total mess. And, I need to sort of correct that if I'm going to go anywhere with it. So my ambition was to be able to compete in Mr. Queensland within 4 years and not make a fool of myself. Well, with that, I went home and my legs were still shaking and I was quite disturbed by the whole experience. And over the next couple of days, I said, no, I'm going to fix this. And it was at that process of starting to go back down to the garage with no weights, just go through the free squats slowly, doing bench presses off the bench there, very slow and steady. And all that noise was very much revealed within my system. But what I noticed is that by just letting it go and not trying to inhibit those dynamics, that the systems tend to calibrate itself much better. And I started to get rid of all the underlying fears and anxieties that were harbored within that, which is based around my life experiences building up to there. So from there, I thought, right, I'm not going to go back to training the way that it was. I'm going to maintain my composure and be more like those older guys, which I did do. And in 2 years' time, I was competing on the world stage at the World Championships of bodybuilding, and I'd already won a Mr. Queensland and so forth. So things happened quite quickly once I got into that mode, and I'd gone back to Mackay, so I wasn't surrounded by the powerlifting fraternity or the bodybuilding fraternity at all. And I just stuck to myself, and I just kept maintaining all these parameters and maintaining composure, not going to failure, nurturing my system along. And but the weights that I was shifting under those conditions were quite significant, in terms of the powerlifting and so forth. But so I just kept working with that over the years, and it wasn't until 1988 that I decided to try some of these techniques on other people when I'd established my centre back in Mackay. And what I was inspired by then, I guess, was the inconsistencies that that Alex touched on in terms of what was in textbooks and what was being practiced and preached and so forth in exercise prescription, rehabilitation in general, and medical intervention, where there was no consistency seemed to be taking place. It was always just hit and miss and based around some particular theory that a person might have had, but there was no collective wisdom taking place amongst all these different people. And so this was a lot of noise within the industries at large, and this was before the internet. So there's way more noise out there now. So I set out to be able to work with my people and develop a program that would be sustainable for them, based around some very fundamental principles that I seen apply to all human beings all of the time. So what are the rules, like posture and emotional integrity and our perception of our environment, and how could we learn about those things through what I was doing and help to calibrate people appropriately back into those states. So as I was more inspired by what was wrong with the system than what was going right in the system, and I've always been inspired by people who've been able to accomplish incredible things against the odds, and that, of course. But that was my biggest inspiration. And over a period of a couple of years, I developed that program, and I'm still working with exactly the same program today because it does every single thing it sets out to do. It has all the guidelines in there. But it was based around some of these very simple rules. And I wanted something that was going to be able to be workable with 100% of the people 100% of the time. And neurophysics therapy has developed its global reputation based around outcomes. But I said there's still so much that's not in the textbook about phenomena that we observe every single day. That's very difficult to get across the line there.
Well, that's a good time to come in, Ken, because I think we've the influences around performance outcome and for different situations, but then we consider, I suppose, and now we're going to tip into the theme of this session around progressive overload and the implications it has on our system, more broadly, not just from a physical perspective. And coming from strength and conditioning, we consider that in the main. But for you're considering, other factors that are make up the person as well. So I think, just asking that, question is very much around, progressive overload. The principle of that is fundamental, in the world of strength and conditioning, but also exercise prescription and how we graduate someone back to, full function, full performance. So I'm keen to hear, what your perception is around that then, or your perspective based on, your given applied environments and how you've practiced. So, maybe if I ask, around progressive overload is, what does it mean to you, and whether it be from performance training or injury rehabilitation, and how is it currently practiced, do you feel? And I'll ask Dave first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, Jamie. I think it is one of the nebulous ones. I think that it's not clear cut, and as some of the old traditional strength and conditioning prescriptive guidelines are, just with a percentage increment of 1 rep max or relative 1 rep max. It's not as simple as that. I think there are a couple of factors. Firstly, I think the first thing that the first principle for me is that the increase in load is a combination of intensity and volume, and the decision you make about how you want to progress the load needs to account for those two elements. And I'll come back to that. The second important principle for me is training age. The training age and experience of the person I'm talking to, the athlete that I'm talking to, has a significant bearing on how I package progressive overload at that point in time in that person's development. And Ken touched on something. I think he touched on what I'm about to say. I think that one of the things that I think our profession and many in exercise prescription don't appreciate as much is, and I'm going to say this in a clumsy way, but bedding down the client or the athlete in the environment that you expect them to train. I think that the perception that they have, we overlook because that's our home ground. And we don't appreciate the extent to which, in the first period, the anxieties or the perceptions that they feel by going into that environment have a direct impact on physical capability, and the way it starts can influence the way it proceeds for the rest of their career if we don't manage it correctly. Now, very seldom do you see that as something actively taught in a coach or a personal training situation, where your communication and perception of the client's perception of the environment has on bedding down that overload, because it makes all the difference. I know for a fact that if I go in week 1 and it's 3 sessions, I know that if I've done my job right, we come to session 4 in week 2, there'll be a significant uplift of physical capability, which has nothing to do with training effect. Just the fact that there's more comfort and assurance in that environment because I have done my job correctly in bedding that down. So I think that's really important, and it's slightly left field for overload, but it is important. I think Ken pointed that out. It can influence significantly early on. So I think if we just talk about resistance training, load and volume, I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a whole bunch of research, Stu Phillips and so on, showing that volume and you can go high reps and still get maximal strength. And there's been a turnaround on that, and I'm not prepared to get involved in that debate. I know what I know and I know what I believe. And without a doubt, I think that early on training age is low. The most important thing there is to develop lifelong buy-in to that type of training. So any level of resistance training that you can bed down at that point in time and win the client over or the athlete over is enough, and it's going to have an effect. And all we want from the effect is enough for them to feel, I feel stronger and I feel more powerful and I feel more explosive and fast at some point in time down the line, because that hooks them further. So I'm not fussed about significant progressive overload. I use it as a reward for them to find their own reward in their progression. But what's not negotiable through all of that is technical incompetence and basic requirements. Range of movement, you can't buy a change in that for me. That is not negotiable. Range of movement is fundamental. It drives me up the wall. I prefer to train in my garage than in a public place, because people pretend. And it's like Ken says, go back to the basics and it'll all come, and then it'll be a real strength. So range of movements, and obviously in more complex lifts, the squat and some of the Olympic lifts, technique. And because of the PhD that I did, we all know that in the first window of development in a back squat, we fail because of our trunk integrity. Your leg strength isn't even challenged until you've got the capacity to carry that load through your trunk. And only after a period of time, and I'm not even going to hazard a guess here because it'll cause a bushfire out there, but at some point in time, you have the trunk integrity to keep the bar over the base of support and therefore challenge the legs. And while that's happening, in most circumstances, strength coaches don't appreciate the value of what's happening in the trunk, and that's fundamental. But the way we manage technique in that situation to keep the trunk posture correct, the bar over the base of support, those are fundamental techniques that help keep that trunk integrity to eventually come to be able to load the limb. And the same applies for all other exercises. So those are my key principles. Training age is really fundamental. Managing the relationship between, so as I get further down the line, minimal dose, optimal dose, or jargon, I would always refer or defer or revert back to as little volume as I can carry to get the resistance or the strength training adaptation that I'm looking for, and that is a experiential wish. There are some more and more papers coming out. Having said that, again, they haven't accounted correctly for training age, so I can't really draw that into my practice. But I would say that I would do less volume and do higher intensity as a default, regardless of training age, as soon as I have that competency in place. Enough, Jamie. Thank you. I can see you getting agitated.
No, I think, Dave, you raised some really important points. And these are some of the things, whether we're talking about sport or you're talking about, in general populations, context is really important. Behavioral kind of connection to this is very important. Links with what Ken is talking about there around our perception, and obviously having I suppose a calmed state as we do it. But I think, the broader implications are when we talk about trunk strength and trunk integrity with the triple flexion action, is that it's really important as we get older as well, recognizing that for functional integrity, the WHO highlight that strength is really important as we age, so it's and it leads to early mortality rates as a loss of strength and function. So on that point, I'll put that to Alex, because I know that you're doing a lot of work around, obviously, yes, isometrics as a tie-in to your training, but obviously the implications of force application.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Thanks for that, David. There's so much in that. That was brilliant and really holistic look at overload. I'll try and be succinct here, which is rare for me, Jamie, but I reckon, so if I encompass all of the things we're doing from a performance standpoint, from the running side of things, the plyometrics, the drills, the strength, and so forth, for me, overload or progressive overload is multifaceted. So it is definitely the intensity and the volume. There's also frequency in there that's important. There's variation, like what type of stimulus you're going to do in terms of the actual exercise. Say plyos, if you're going from 2 legs to 1 legs as an overload, for example, a type of overload. There's the literally within a set, if you like, in a strength training format, to within the week or week to week or block to block overloading. And then there's the concept of overload where we're looking at loading comparative to a capacity, if you like. So like a concentric strength capacity, and then applying super maximal loads above that, which would be using other various forms of contractions or muscle actions, so to speak. So look at and view it in two very, very different aspects. And I think one interesting point, and I think Dave was sort of mentioning it too, in a way, is I think back to some of where this has all originally come from, and Milo of Crotona, carrying the cow to the fields every day. Now I reckon there was periods of time within that cow wasn't growing day to day, and Milo probably wasn't growing day to day as well. So actually understanding that staying in a period of plateau where not a lot of changing, but you're maximizing adaptation within periods of time. So a lot of people think overload is necessarily week to week to week, keep going, and it doesn't take a a scientist to understand that there's probably going to be a ceiling hit very, very soon if you keep going that way, right? So just another concept to think about too in terms of plateauing and really establishing. We've got loads of data on where we've just hit a straight loading on a squat, for example, and not changed anything, and just seen week to week to week or month to month improvements on barbell velocity, where a whole heap of other things are coming into the system, right? Coordinatively, intermuscular coordination in particular, and the skill development side alone, shifting sort of barbell velocity up.
So a high degree of complexity there then, Alex, and it's obviously again contextually driven. So we talk about specificity is important to that. So we're going to lead that then to Ken. So when I talk about complexity, in Ken, if you've read any of Ken's work, which I've had the good fortune to have, is that it's there's a lot about systems approaches and complexity and chaos. So I'll hand you to Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Well, both Dave and Alex said some beautiful things here that are very much in synergy with where we're at, and the things that we've been practicing for these many, many years. But that fundamentally it's what Dave said. It's perception. So it doesn't matter what the body doesn't understand the math. It wouldn't understand even while we're counting with things. It purely relates to how does Ken feel about what Ken's doing right now, the biochemical and biohormonal responses to that. We can only ever be in one of two possible states. We're either in a state of growth or in a state of protection. We can't be in the middle. It's like trying to be happy and sad at the same time. So we look for what would be a typical thing where we see a person in a state of protection. Too much tension, too much background tension in their systems as they're performing a task where there shouldn't be that much background tension. So they've learned to be overprotective and over-responsive or overreactive to environmental stimuli. So progressive overload is a necessary thing in terms of developing robustness and helping the person to become impervious to perturbation and just basically world noise. So it's not just what the athlete's doing in terms of the game and all those other, it's all the other things they've got to deal with, the media and a whole heap of other influences that come in that are continually augmenting their system. How much time they spend on social media, all these type of things have an influence, and it all is putting information into the system that we see when we start to perform what we see that noise start to become revealed within their system, how there's so much competing information within that. So what we typically look for initially is establishing some sets of rules. So for starters, posture is a rule. We know everything in nature has been calibrated to that vertical constant. It is the only true constant there is in nature. So everything, by the way that trees are shaped, the root systems, it's all relative to that vertical constant. And my argument, not so much argument, but some of my other scientific colleagues could not work out why they can't keep repeating their experiments the way. And I've said because you're not measuring it against any true constant. What we're doing with therapy, we have that constant with the machines that we use. It's all to do with that gravitational field. We're putting people in the grid. Like I said, we know that posture is relevant to our emotional integrity. So you're not going to see a depressed person walking through a shopping centre, chest out, shoulders back. They'll need to maintain a certain postural state. So usually the shoulders are rolled forward to maintain the metabolic conditions that help support the depression state. So first thing we need to do is go through and sort of say, okay, now how is this person perceiving their environment? So just doing some basic proprioception testing, which I'll probably go through a bit later on. Simple things like standing on one leg at a time with their eyes closed and seeing the relationship between what's happening when their eyes are open to when their eyes are closed. And we see this day, because the visual system is so dominant in our sensory experience of our world, that there's huge discrepancies now because our visual system has become so dominant with all the technology that we're using. So it starts to ignore information coming from the body. Now, the visual system is our most dominant sensory experience, and any deficits that we see in physical performance, it's all interacting with how the visual is, or feed forward with how the visual system is operating. So, it's going to support our skills. The visual system helps to support our skill set, but it will support rogue sets of skills just as much. So we need to go through and find out and calibrate the person's system and get them to be able to respond to environmental stimuli in a very composed, orderly manner at micro scales first. Because if they can't do that under micro scales, there's no way in the world when that dial gets turned up, it's going to be any better than that. So again, we're talking about perception. How we perceive our world is how we're going to respond to it. Proprioception being nested within our perceptual landscape as to what we perceive to be our reality. So it's a very good check and balance on a person's overall perception of things. And once everything starts to become calibrated, then through the application of increasing performance criteria, through volume, through intensity, all those type of things, to be able to help the system become more robust and embedded into their state. But we're working from some very reliable sets of initial conditions that can do that. If something goes wrong, we go back, set up some initial conditions again, and then progress from there. But yes, to develop that robustness and making them impervious to perturbation and having the system maintain a soft assembly state while they're dealing with higher levels of stress and demand. That's what the goal is. But yes, overload principle is definitely at play.
So if I can extend that with you, Ken, is that you're kind of leading into I suppose the next question I'm going to ask is, so when you're faced with, and I know that with you it's rehabilitation, and we're now going to move into the rehabilitation realm, is what are some of the the extending from that, what are some of the kind of fundamental questions you ask, so you can deliver that effective service? So one of the things I know you attest by is treat the person, not the condition or the injury. So can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yes, Jamie. Well, you did right. I mean, that's the underpinnings of neurophysics therapy: treat the person and not the disorder. But we're talking about a system at large, a psychophysical system where there's no privileged point of observation. So it's not about a knee or a back or anything like that. It's a system at large, and so we understand what are its inputs, what are its outputs. And it's the integration of our sensory experience of the world into that, so we can see how the person's perceiving the environment and how they're responding to it in a very reliable, measurable fashion. But the questions that we would ask a person is, obviously, how did the injury occur? Was it something that was a self-injury where they were just doing something and all of a sudden the hamstring was torn? The impact, or was it an impact type of insult to the system? But also, we're looking for the psychological effects of that injury on that person. So probably I'll highlight an example here. I would consider there would be a large difference in psychological effect to a person like Nathan Cleary, who's torn his hamstring. He's the captain of the New South Wales Rugby League team, state of origin team, and what that means to him and how might he feel he's let his fans down, all these other types of things, as opposed to a regular reserve grade player playing in a local tournament type of thing. So there's a huge impact on the player that can have a bearing on their recovery rate. So we need to understand a bit, how do they feel about their injury? What is their perception of their injury to them? And we can understand a little bit about what the nature of their injury is, but we can also estimate, is this person overreacting to their injury, or are they being a little bit negligent in the way they're going about it? And then from there, again, just setting about, okay, what are the rules here? So forgetting about the injury, it's not about that. It's like, what happened within this system at large where something went wrong. So if they injured themselves while they're running or doing something like that, there's a breakdown in the system's integrity. So we need to get back in there and see where these dodgy little bits are taking place and the little clunky bits are taking place, and how they're moving through their environment, through the grids that we operate with. So that's a bit of an overview of the whole thing. There's a lot of discrete values in between that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ken. I appreciate that. And I think that's where I'm going to now put this to Alex, because acknowledging Alex has to manage up to 40, as Dave has, on a number of occasions. Alex is doing that now, whereas managing different disciplines, and how do you, when you're asking questions, not just off your athletes, but also off your practitioners and how they operate and integrate to deliver an effective service.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jamie. Look, yeah, any time, because of the environments I've worked in, we're obviously working as a performance team or a multidisciplinary team, however you want to call it, with a lot of people around a table discussing the issue. But if I have my strength and conditioning hat on and I'm speaking directly to the medical team, I'm wondering straight away, what does the research say in terms of timelines, and what does our experience collectively say in terms of timelines for whatever injury it is? Because that's going to give me something to work from, almost work backwards from, into what we've got in front of us today. I'll always be asking the question, what that can they do? I think that's normal terminology now with most of us from a conditioning perspective. It doesn't always help it happen, of course, but that's often what we're trying to drive within our performance teams as well. What can they do, not what can't they do, and going at it around that from that sort of mindset. I often, because I have much more of a, again, I've got to find a better word than aggressive, right? But a more aggressive mindset in terms of trying to get the athlete back. What I want to do then is also put out the scenarios of, if I do X, which is obviously well planned, so we're not going to be jumping to anything crazy anytime soon. But if I put out the scenario, if I do X, what could happen? You know, I mean, I'm not going to be doing something that's going to cause a re-rupture of whatever it might be. But if I do X, what's the worst that can happen in that environment? And get the team to discuss that. Oh, look, a little bit of a setback, might be a bit sore. Fine. Okay. And then we decide what our risk tolerance is as a group. And that might not just between us, it's going to be the coach as well. It's going to be what part of the season we're in. Is there a major competition that, you know, is life defining that they've got to get to before they retire, for example, an Olympic Games? What is our level of risk? Are we going to try and get an athlete back for the finals series, even though they got injured in pre-season? Is that something we're able to do? Are we all in it together? Has the athlete in it? Is the coach in it? And we're all going to hit this plan together, and we all establish that. So what's our risk? And then ultimately on the acute side of things is, what pain is okay? Because there's going to be some pain. What pain are we okay with medically and as a performance team? And then from there, we monitor and adjust each time, and we keep pushing the boat out a little bit. We see what response there has been the next day. Has there been an issue? Has there not been? Has there been a flare up? Is it heat? Is it swelling? Is it whatever? No, great. We go again, and then we calculate our progressions from then on moving forward. I think one caveat too is to understand that in this team, we as performance coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, call it what you may, we are, dare I say, the masters of load. We have to understand that, especially when you've earned your stripes and you understand it. You understand load better than anyone else in the team, normally, okay? And I can give you a quick anecdote there. I remember a time when a sprinter we were working with broke his radius. And so that's fine for a sprinter to a degree, but they do have to block start, right? And I remember one stage a surgeon telling us that he can only lift 3 kilos in the gym, but he was fine to do his block starts. Now, it just so happened we had just done some published research, and we knew that 20 kilograms of load was going through that arm on the block start, right? And that's just holding a position. And it's a classic kind of thing. And then once we handed the research to the guy, and this was Phil Graham Smith's led research, handed that to the surgeon and the physio in charge, of course, the very next day we were able to start loading him up properly in his dumbbell pressing and bench pressing and so on. But just to understand where we sit in that spectrum too, and where we are really able to call shots and influence the rest of that multidisciplinary team.
No, thanks, Alex. And I think, look, Dave, and maybe extend that question for you, just so that you don't feel you're, I suppose, giving just that angle. You've managed, obviously, a number of teams over the last, what has it been, 20-something years now? And I mean staffing teams as well. So what are some of the, Alex touched on there around reviewing research, experience, load monitoring, etc. What are some of the broader strategies have you used to kind of help map and guide, the process?
I think what I'll just pick up on something that both Alex and Ken just said there. The quest to have a established formula or a thermometer that we can just put in and come out and say that's what we can do is always going to be there in our profession, but it can't exist. That's why that personal one-to-one contact with the athlete and a multidisciplinary team with good communication is the only way to, because the healing process is as individual as the color of my hair. And we can only determine that after we walk into the gym on that day. There is no formula, there is no textbook that's going to tell us what it is. And we have very established but not scientific methods of determining the state of healing by doing something, eliciting a level of pain, saying that's too much, that's okay, that's too little, let's go hard, let's not go at all, etc. So I think that is really important. But just off the top, I would also like to go back to something Ken said at the very beginning. I think the most important thing when you come across. I'm very, very seldom, until a long time ago in my career, am I first point of contact on an injury. I'm always at some point down the line in the recent years. But the point is, mechanism of injury is really important, and the stage, the state of the athlete at the time of the injury is really, really important, because that it should contribute, as far as I'm concerned, to the target, to what we're aiming to achieve, to not just get back to performance, but to get back to performance and be robust against re-injury. Because the state that we are when we were injured is something that we engineered, or we were part of, perhaps, and that we want to use that to educate us or to inform us to go and make that athlete more robust. And also the context, is it retirement year? Is it young up-and-coming person that we really need to make robust for a big career in the future? But to touch on your question, Jamie, at long last, is that I would say that the communication and development relationships in the multidisciplinary team is such an important factor. And without any evidence, I would say that in the UK, I worked within the institute system from its conception in 2000, or even before that, in Scotland, and then ultimately the institute evolved or got opened in England and then in Ireland. And in the Athens cycle, it was, if we reflect back on those days, it's embarrassing, the technical coach just ruled, and any expertise around the table was entirely dependent on the technical coach doffing a bit of favor to them to have an input, But it was ironic, because when we went into the Beijing cycle the following 4 years, it completely changed in my personal experience. There were senior athletes that had then got into coaching positions through the Athens cycle and were now in coaching positions, and those multidisciplinary teams were functional. There were technical experts sitting there, and their voice was heard. I'm not saying everybody had a say, but their voice got onto the table, and the debate happened, and conflict took place, and an agreement was reached, and we left the room, and the athlete got the best product. And I would say that just, and I know that without a doubt in Australia, that has been the case since before the 2000s, as a consequence of the institute setup, because I'm pretty familiar and connected to that. And we were chasing after that in a clumsy way. And I would say, if there was a way of measuring it, that quality of communication and relationship building at MDT level within the UK has direct correlation to medal success in the UK Olympic journey up until now. So without a doubt, fundamental. And it's almost accidental where it works well, but there are systems now where leadership structures can manage that to make sure that it happens, or at least bad practice is addressed.
No, that's great, Dave. Really informative. And I think drawing on what you've said there is tipping in now to the point we're talking about strategies and systems and processes, and that leads me to the next question is around acknowledging that you've all used different technologies to help, I suppose, bring evidence and clarity to what you're doing and processes. So, can you tell us a little bit about, some of the technologies that you've used and how you've used them? If I put that to you first, Ken, because you're going to come at it with a slightly different angle here and how you've measured. And for those other listeners and viewers who are watching, is that a lot of work that Ken has done in recent times is done. It's almost like a services end of the line therapies for people who have gone through conventional therapies, and he's dealing with people who have had severe spinal cord injuries, and major mental and emotional trauma, and he manages and actually works with them through that. So yeah, Ken, tell us a little bit about some of the technologies and the systems you've used.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. It's always been a bit of a reverse engineering feat for myself, but because first we had the results and the outcomes, and we knew why that was all being achieved, but it was very hard to get this across the table and sort of to expand neurophysics therapy to a larger audience. So the use of technology became very important in terms of publications and so forth. And so some of the technology that I used, it was the EEG, ECG, and EMG simultaneously, which I couldn't find anybody in the world at that particular time back in 2011 that actually had done that. So I was looking for the systems results, like the outcomes of what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the autonomic nervous system at the same time as what's going on in the physiology. So the EMGs were taken at very sensitive areas of the body, like the adductor pathway, the abdominal region just adjacent to the navel, and the trapeze area, which is very responsive to the sympathetic nervous system. So we know if we get stressed or anxious at all, it's going to very quickly show up on the trapeze. And I've been doing my work for a very long period of time, and the tone that we see in people's trapeze today far exceeds what we would have seen back in the mid-90s and so forth. So people's, the level of hypervigilance in people's system and the athletes is the same thing. They come along with they're broken down, and all of a sudden we've got to start putting them back together again. This level of hypervigilance, but the sympathetic nervous system, it's not negotiable that these have to be learned how to control those particular pathways. But anyway, with all that sampling, so we were looking at taking neurophysics therapy at rest. So we take 5 minutes of that through all these channels. We do during neurophysics therapy for a small 5-minute sample usually on the pec fly, because they're targeting a highly sensitive area there. And then post neurophysics therapy, which would be taking place about 2 hours later at rest. So we can see the transitions that have occurred in that period of time, but they always coincide with the benefits that the person has received or have accomplished throughout that process. So like I said, there's benefits there, but then how do you prove it? And I know in science you could teach 10 pigs how to sing in harmony, but unless you had some data, it just simply didn't happen. So we have that approach to it. We've used Zebra's technology, the gait and stance analysis, so quite sophisticated. And again, we do pre-neurophysics therapy where we got some baseline measurement of their stance and gait. We don't do anything until after the 4 days, when we've completed that 4-day period, which is when we're looking at accomplishing some significant outcomes within that 4 days. So that's the window for us. And then we take that again and we see that the difference is. So that's quite measurable, that, and it's very, very good to see that the system itself has calibrated itself much better within its environment, and now it's responding to it in a very systematic manner. And we've also used high frequency, or if you wish, high resolution thermal imaging, so infrared technology, which shows some beautiful pictures of transitions taking place. So you can see the person at rest, you can see where the hot spots are, very clear detail. You can see as they're going through the movements, because heat is just energy, and how energy is uniformly distributed through our body. So you can see as they go through the process, the distribution of energy and information through their system. It starts to become much more something that we'd see a nice set of flow and a nice set of distribution. So, like I said, it's given that the person is gaining results, but we like to see within that data what that is all account, how you account for those results, and having the publication in Frontiers, the hypothesis in Frontiers in Physiology back in 2013. That was in advance of having any data really published. So it was a hypothesis, and like any hypothesis, then you say, okay, now you've got to prove what the hypothesis is saying. So that's what we've used. I'd really love to have a person working with me again, so I can have them to start to harvest the data as we're moving around, because we've just been able to achieve some amazing things with people, and we're going, my golly, I wish we had that data.
Thanks, Ken. And Ken, I think just to raise the point, just for in terms of layman, having looked at some of the I suppose the infrared mapping that you have done within your research is you can see when there's as you would term it, a hypervigilance in the nervous system, and your therapy allows that to calm and also to create balance between hemispheres of the brain and then corresponding peripheral nervous system left and right for balance in the system. Is that correct?
Correct, absolutely. Yeah, the lateralization of the hemispheres is everything. Basically, when there's a discrepancy within those hemispheres, where people, just by doing a simple proprioception test, a person with their eyes closed and coming across their body nice and slow and steady, not fast. And the whole idea is for those fingers to touch together. Now, just in that action alone, you can see lots of different iterations of the people. You'll see a dominance if they're sort of swinging off to one side. They perceive that they're here, but they're actually over there. So their relationship with their environment is disturbed. But like I said before, proprioception is just nested within our perception landscape as to what we perceive to be our reality. If we see errors in proprioception, it's a given that there's all errors at all other levels of perception of the person. Nobody's purposely going out and making those perceptions. They see things for as they are, hear things for as they are. But as that information gets downloaded in their system because of stresses or vigilance within their system, that's where the errors occur. And the turbulence begins because there's a conflict between what the innate nervous system knows about reality and what the person's subjective version is of that reality. So turbulence is the result of competing energies, and that turbulence can manifest itself in all sorts of ways, anxiety disorders, or it's one of the reasons why people wear iPods and they're trying to do other things to escape that internal dialogue and that noise that's going on. But it's the ability to be able to expose that noise. And so fundamentally, proprioception is so fundamental to us, and our systems are so sensorily dependent upon that. If we don't have good proprioception, we're going to have a compromised relationship with our environment. So, the finger to the tip of the nose and back to the finger again. We're looking for nice, clean lines, and we see a lot of discrepancies where a person might take one arm out and the other arm goes in a different pathway. So there's two different percepts of what's actually taking place there. Now, that just shows everything that's going on in their system is interconnected to that, what we just seen. If we want to change what's going on in that system, we need to really reset these initial conditions. So we've got a lot of certainty. So they can see that there's a lot of uncertainty experienced. As they go through, they start to create more certainty, and it becomes much more deterministic about their level of performance. But you've also have evidence that neurons in their brain or their system at large are firing differently to how they were before. And if you're bragging about being any type of therapist, you need evidence that neurons are firing differently to how they were before. So, or otherwise it can be like driving a car with the wheel unbalanced. Yes, you're getting a better level of performance, but the underlying initial states of the initial conditions aren't good. So somewhere along the line, that's going to start to break down.
That's great, Ken. Thanks for that. And I think that this is a perfect opportunity to go back to how this discussion, or, we kind of brought this together as individuals. Is Alex's work, I say back in February last year, even though it was an N of 1. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found, and maybe obviously for the audience who haven't seen that?
Yeah, sure. It was like I say, our hypothesis was that we were going to see a greater discrepancy as the load increased in terms of asymmetries. So we would just favor the dominant limb more and more and more.
Sorry, what was that for, Alex? What exercise?
It was for a back squat. Yeah, it was for a back squat. So that's what we thought we would see. But in fact, what happened was they became more symmetrical as the load increased. So classically, there's higher order things going on there where, if we did have a dominant limb in a heavy back squat. So remember, we went up to 80% 1RMs, I believe. So we were getting quite heavy. If we were if that asymmetry existed with a heavy back squat, then you're probably going to cause yourself an injury, right? There's that risk there. So instead, the remapping neurologically, which I'm not going to try and speak to, I'm learning a lot as I sit here and listen to, is there's clearly remapping to keep some sort of central between the base of support. So that's naturally occurring. That's not something we're consciously trying to do. It's just naturally occurring as a product of load and clearly us trying to be safer, essentially.
No, that's great, and I think this is where Dave, is off the back of seeing that, I thought of Dave straight away. In the conversations we used to have almost 20 years ago, around the importance of the back squat and seeing it as almost this kind of central column in the building, and it gives us that kind of I suppose the central strength, through the body. But Dave, you've obviously, as I said before, I was introduced to technology and dynamometry, back then. And I can remember not doing it very well. My first trip, you sent me away with a national team and I came back and botched it and you weren't very happy at all. You might not remember that, but I certainly do. So anyway, if you want to tell us a little bit about, and obviously we've spoken about Chris Hoy and the kind of work you did with him initially, because I tell the story that how you went down to Manchester and you walked away thinking, how can I help you? I think he was just world champion for the first time at that time. He was squatting 202.5 at 93 kilos body weight, arse to grass. And you thought, well, what can I do for this guy?
Yeah, I'll just start by saying it'd be really interesting, Alex, to have to see if single leg squats would emphasize that asymmetry, but we'll park that. But yeah, Jamie, that's exactly as it was. Chris Hoy wasn't a champion anywhere. I think he was a national champion at that point in time. But they were in such good shape and they were really training. Given where I was at that stage, I had to have a firm chat to myself in a quiet place, because it was where my expertise was really matched with the quality of just athlete conduct and their ability to work at that level. They were extremely strong. They had a very, very high work ethic. Still to this day, I would say there are only a handful of athletes that matched that environment that I've come across since. But at the time, it sort of coincided with me having a bit of a concern that I'd heard about a force plate. I'd seen papers published in journals using force plates, and I didn't really understand what that told me. And I remember going to a guy called Marco Cardinali, who happened to be up in Aberdeen doing his PhD. And I said, I really think we should just get a force plate, not knowing why I was asking for it at that point, talking about 1999, end of 99, early 2000. And he said, well, you got to look at this thing called a Muscle Lab, because it's an encoder, and Bosco and this guy from Norway have got it sorted. So I contacted them, and lo and behold, we ended up having a relationship with Muscle Lab and brought out a whole lot. And they also did force plates. But the key point for me was that it gave me the opportunity to measure submaximal velocity of performance at a load between bodyweight jumps and 1 rep max, which is the only other thing I could do. I could do 1 rep max, I could do bodyweight jumps, but I couldn't measure how performance was changing at loads closer to what we were looking for in part of their progression, or loads that we were looking for to put them back into their sport, or to put them into their competition, to let them go out and get the medal, So that made a huge difference to me. And as I said, and Jamie knows, I'd measure that. I even took it through to canoe slalom, and I know someone talked a bit about rate of force development. I think that just measuring pulls off a rack, one way, just the concentric pull off the rack, measuring the rate of the time to peak force from the rack using the encoder, which is really clumsy. Think about it today, but I could plot that on a weekly basis, and I just knew if my taper was going in the right direction, because the athletes were getting a shorter time to peak power and peak force across that simple exercise, which was sort of remotely related to what they were doing in the boat, So that kind of technology made a huge difference to the way I worked, and just my sort of periodization leading into competition and plotting the change in power across that just reinforced things, which was terrific.
So to finish that story, Dave, is I've read the Chris Hoy book, and obviously I've sat in the car with you many moons ago listening to you. We can't, these kind of I suppose interactions. Chris Hoy, I believe, off the back of that, 11 times world champion, 6 times Olympic champion, one of the most decorated British athletes of all time. But he finished his career at the same body weight in London, didn't he? In 2012, he retired. And what was he squatting by then?
I'd sort of finished with him at the end of the Beijing cycle because of the evolution of the English institutes and so on. But he went off to Beijing and he was squatting 239 kilograms, I would say, in that Beijing cycle, same body weight. And in that cycle, we used some eccentric loading, followed by concentric, followed by normal squats, and leading into the power phase. So, yeah, I mean, he had a terrific ethos. And ironically, Craig McLean's another cyclist, also Scottish, that was around at the time, and they both still squat today for fun. And I lectured on a MSc down in Liverpool for a couple of years 2 years ago, and I brought Craig McLean in at the end of the season to do a muscle lab test in front of the students, and he wasn't a million miles away from what he was when he was competing at the top end. And yeah, no, absolutely. And to touch on that, the squat is going to be a really important. The squat movement with load is going to be a really important exercise for managing health in the future, because it hits the biggest muscle mass straight up, so dealing with lifestyle illness, metabolic illness, it is the obvious exercise. We just need to find a way of packaging it in a healthy format and taking the scare away from it. So getting all those people saying, well, you can't squat for that, yes, you can.
Yes. And I think, there's a couple of things jumped out at me there, Dave, is, everything you talked about with Chris Hoy around, his growth mindset, and he was a student of sports science, I think at Edinburgh University, if I'm correct. But the point was, and it leads to what Ken talked about, is we spoke about before context, and we spoke about, the growth mentality. You're either a state of protection or you're a state of growth. And his mindset was about growth and development. He could have stopped many moons beforehand, forget about the weight he was lifting. But, when he became Olympic champion in Athens for the first time, but he kept growing and developing. He saw that as a chart and as a metric of development. So I think leading into the next one, I'm aware of time here. I know that people probably need to get on. So, but I do want to, touch on, we use technologies to help us chart and track and trend and ultimately make really informed decisions individually and collectively. Injury rates are still going up in a lot of sports, so, what do you think, needs to happen to, and it's I suppose quite a broad question, but a couple of points around how we manage them, and noting that, Alex, you've spent time in Australian rules recently, and Dave's obviously been, around rugby for a long time. Ken, you've dealt with general populations with advanced disease disorder, but also athletes who have been crippled by, mental, emotional, not just physical injuries. So what are some of the key things that we need to, and Ken, I suppose this is for you to start with, around noise, and how we kind of manage that noise?
Yeah, for sure. And first, I'd like to just go back to what Dave said. And Dave, I've often said, for everybody, if you could just do one thing only to help you get yourself back on track, it would be the squat. Because it is, and as you said, there's larger nothing is going to expose underlying anxieties quicker than what a slow, steady squat will do. And all the person is doing is getting information from their own body that they've become offended with. You can see that anxiety will increase, and then they'll suddenly move out of there. So it shows that anxiety dictates what they do next. So all that detraining of the amygdala and all those areas that should be reporting safety and comfort have crossed over and telling lies to the cortex, and the cortex is just agreeing with it. So all that has to be calibrated. And Alex, yes, on that principle of overload and getting rid of asymmetries, we use that all the time. We can see people going through, I can't quite get this right. And for them, they think they need to lighten the load up to get it right. We say, no, you're not doing enough. You need to put more load on to pull this out into place. So it just becomes a rule. So when we're talking about something going on the left side of the body, the right hemisphere, right side of the body, appreciating you've got to go back to the hemispheres. Everything's about the brain. So left side, it's right hemisphere, and vice versa. So that, like I said, the lateralization of that. When you have a medium like a squat, for example, so you've got holding onto the bar, you've got that medium for you to talk to. So even through your hands. So your hands provide a grid, a part of that grid. Your feet are the other part of that grid. So 4 points of distribution through your system. So it's like a football field. Anything can happen on that field that's going to contribute to the outcome of the game, but nothing can happen outside of it. So it's leaking. But under load, the hemispheres very quickly kiss and make up and get on the same page, because there's a higher level of stress and demand, and there's a little bit of self-preservation that goes along with that. So there's nothing like a bit of self-preservation to make our systems line back up again and get in. Otherwise, it'll stay fluctuating in this attractive state where it's flipping back and forward. We need to put more pressure on the system to get it to collaborate and to be able to work much more uniformly together. But Jamie, just addressing your question there. Yes, I mean, I think a week and a half ago, there were 17 West Coast Eagles on the sideline through injury. And injuries, like at this level, they can, in a team situation, they can beget injuries. So all of a sudden, there's more pressure on the remaining players to perform better. They're starting to feel that pressure. One of their star players is out now, so there's more pressure on them to perform, and that pressure alone can start to manifest itself in undesirable manner. So it's we're seeing the advancements in training perhaps, but unless we're engaged in a conversation, an intelligent conversation like this, and seeing the people who are really taking notice of what's going on, instead of just trying to brute force things, no pain, no gain, all that type of attitude, it's still very much alive and well out there, and it just simply doesn't work. You're not going to see Roger Federer training in a gym, busting and yelling and screaming and going to. Everything is about composure, maintaining that degree of composure while you're introducing higher levels of stress and demand on the system. So it's that whole idea of giving away no clues to the observer that your system's under any stress. And it's like, take a line out of the sprinter's handbook. You watch those athletes lining up the 100-meter final of the Olympic Games. They're calming themselves right down because they need to respond to that start signal within 15 to 16 milliseconds, where microseconds, where the startle time of the average person is about 50 to 80. So that would be expensive in that thing. Well, the startle time of people today is getting worse and worse. You've only got to be at traffic lights and see how long it takes people to respond to the traffic light. So that startle time is very, very important. But when you see the athlete running in slow motion, you'd see that footage, their jaws are relaxed and everything just flows. So the more composed they are, the more energy they can release into the ground to be able to project them forward again. If all of a sudden you see Usain Bolt running in front of you, 10 meters in front of you, and you start to tense up to try to catch up, it's all over. So that whole ability, that thing about flow and distribution through the system. But I've seen people, training athletes and think, oh my God, even surf lifesaving, training young people like young nippers on the beach, and the things that they're putting them through, relentless sit-ups and all that type of thing. And that's somehow supposed to toughen their system up. So there's a lot of education needs to take place. And if we call it, if we're looking at the correlation between so-called advancements in training, then we've got to account for all these injuries that are occurring. Why there's so many injuries occurring in the sport, because there's obviously a correlation there. And even with the rehabilitation techniques, as Dave mentioned, the whole idea is to package that person so they become more robust, even perhaps better than what they were before as they're going through it, So it's not just about trying to patch them up and doing some cute things with limbs and all that type of thing to get them back out onto the field again. It's what are we going to do to assist this person to develop that robustness and become more impervious to those perturbations.
No, thanks, Ken. Thanks. And I think, look, again, being, I'm conscious that people have got other things need to move on. Alex, if you were to give, maybe one actionable, to the listeners listening to around, this, what piece of advice would you give around, everything we've spoken about today, about how we manage progressive overload, the training environment? You're dealing with a lot of people at once. What one thing would you advise around working in a multidisciplinary environment and how you can actually, I suppose, better evidence and manage that process?
Yeah, look, remove fluff from programs, do stuff that's actually going to make a difference, and be consistent with that stuff that's going to make a difference. Establish non-negotiables within your program that is going to make a difference and put them in. The fluff not only wastes time, but it actually just gradually fills this bucket up, that's very limited bucket, with just stuff, with just mess. So if I was going to give you just one or a couple points, that for me would be some of the biggest I would suggest. And I guess you only said one, but I'm going to go a little bit more individualized. I hear this cop out all the time. We've got 35 players or we've got 40 players. So we just have a strength group, we'll have a hypertrophy group and whatever. That's an absolute cop out for mine. When you're dealing with $1 million athletes and you're not individualizing the program specific for that individual, from an injury history to a type of loading to the age development level to the everything you can think of, the position and the sport, the actual playing position and so on. So a few things there just quickly, as I know we're running out of time, so but they're things that we can grab on to straight away in action.
Yeah, and Dave, so you're obviously crossing over now. You've sport and you're dealing with students next generation who will go into health as well. So what kind of advice would you give, when working with whether it be general populations? And Alex raises some really salient points around individualization and really understand the circumstance of the individual, which is we've spoken about at some length.
Sorry,
already.
Jamie, you're breaking up a little bit there, so I didn't really get the gist of what you want me to answer. So
yeah, look, I'll quickly repeat it. I'm just saying you're crossing over, into health space when you're working now with students who will be moving not just into sport, but also mainly into that, the kind of the health environment. So working with general populations. So what kind of advice would you give, practitioners who, can make best use of working working with clients, but working within a multidisciplinary team?
Well, I'd say in similar to Alex, that they need to develop an understanding of compound and complex lifts for whole body exercises, understand the theory behind that, and become really competent at coaching them in different populations, and then also looking at the science behind how to load those. Just with regards to the previous question, we have a significant amount of research on how loading the squat exercise increases the structure and the strength and the integrity of the muscle and the tendons. But we have sports that have a culture that prevents that exercise having an impact. And in that sport in the US, and female football in the US has got the highest injury cost for ACL injury. It's eye-watering cost, and the sport still prevents the implementation of the type of exercise that is just shown with extensive research to develop those structures to prevent that injury. So absolutely, just embrace that, because at the moment social media and the general opinion is not that. It's every other gimmicky thing that looks like strength and conditioning, but it's not. Load in a standing position, which isn't necessarily the answer to everything, but it is. It has got a significant value as the fundamental building block in any development of an athlete and for health circumstances as well.
Yeah, Ken, quickly, what about you? What one piece of advice would you give to our viewers and listeners?
Just to get all the fundamental things right first, and there are a few of them, and so it is that proprioception. So every single individual out there, these are things that we need to do daily practices, and you can certainly see how well you slept and so forth and how much stress you're under. Doing that proprioception, like I said, coming across your body nice and slow and steady, the finger to nose and back steady again. So if there's errors in that, there's going to be errors in how you're responding to the environment. A fundamental thing we do when we're children is just flop our legs back and forth like this. And then you go and ask a person, like even any athlete, and all of a sudden they start to facilitate that, and you see how clunky it all is all of a sudden. So we've gone from something, so that's a very fundamental thing we do, that whole adductor pathway that controls all this 360 degrees of movement through our system. It means that every time you put their left foot on the ground, it's telling a different story to the brain when they put their right foot on the ground. So that just something as basic as that needs to be corrected, because if you can't see that happening, well, of course, there's going to be other things going on in the person's system. The ability to inhibit one leg while they perform that with the other leg and vice versa, and to see that there's a sense of sameness where most people will detect that one side feels different to the other side. All that needs to be corrected under those subtle scales. The standing on one leg at a time, which I mentioned before, with the eyes open first to take that measurement, and then with the eyes closed to we assess, is there a difference between left and right? But mostly to see the big discrepancy is in the visual system, because there shouldn't be a lot of difference between eyes open and eyes closed. So, and that's something that needs to be practiced to be able to be brought back online again. So regardless of what we're doing, what our ambitions are, if we look at the fundamental things, we don't need to write new programs. We don't need to do complex things to correct what some people might consider complex disorders. Get the fundamental things right first, and then build the argument from there.
Well, thank you. Look, I'm going to wrap up on that. I know people, if I say, need to get on. We are recording this, and for those who have logged in and got the link, you'll be able to watch this back, and also we'll put it up on the website as well for those who would like to watch it again. If you want to share that with somebody. So it'll be on the website. Now, if you have any questions, granted we wanted to get 2 questions, I thought it was a fascinating, conversation, and we could go on for a lot longer. But if you do have any questions, what we'll do is we'll try and facilitate how we can funnel them through and maybe farm them off to either Alex, Dave, or Ken. But look, I'd like to thank you as our panel for coming on and agreeing to do this. Logistically, it's challenging. Dave on the other side of the world, and Alex to some degrees on the other side of the world as well for a Queenslander, and but we've also, there are viewers and listeners coming, and I know that we've got a number who have held on from here. We have had interest of up to 750 people who want to view this. So that has been fantastic and a testament to the draw of the panel today. So look, thank you. And thank you to Dan in the background. Didn't get a chance to ask his question. I do have one from him, but we'll save that and we'll send that out. Okay, so anyway, I'll let you get on with your day and your evening. Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you again.